It began before Abigail even crossed the threshold of her childhood home, the wind cutting through her leather jacket like a warning she was too numb to heed. The moment she set foot on that sagging porch, the past pressed in around her. Each loose board under her boots seemed to echo with memories she'd long buried beneath assignments and deadlines. She'd left Harmony Falls 15 years ago, chasing the wild beauty of the world, but returning to settle her father's estate felt less like closure and more like stepping back into a story she'd abandoned halfway through. 3 weeks had gone by since she laid Peter Stewart to rest in that lonely cemetery beyond the ridge, and every morning she found herself waking to the same aching void, as though the house itself had exhaled a breath she could barely follow. The ranch that once thrived under her father's steady hand was unrecognizable. Tall grass strangled the pathways, the barn's roof bowed under years of neglect, and the white fence she'd once helped him paint was now little more than peeling splinters. And yet, amid the decay, there was a pulse, a living thread that wove the old homestead back into the land of the free. She felt it first in the shape that emerged at the broken fence line, coat gleaming copper in the early light. A Mustang, wild and wiry, with a white blaze down its face as if it carried a secret message across its brow. Abigail froze, heart hammering, because she recognized that look, the same keen intelligence she'd seen reflected in her own eyes when she pressed her camera's shutter, the same unspoken wisdom old-timers said these horses carried for those who still listened. That morning the Mustang didn't bolt or shy away. Instead, it dipped its head twice, a deliberate nod that seemed to say, "I've been waiting for you." Abigail, who'd grown up around gentle quarter horses but never felt the draw of the ranch life, found herself stepping forward, curiosity and something deeper, something ancestral, pulling her onward. Her hand hovered in midair, fingertips tingling, as if the air itself hummed with possibility. How long had it been since she'd felt this spark? She had no working camera with her. She'd left it behind in her haste to escape Alaska's ice fields, but she didn't need it. This moment demanded more than a photograph. It demanded her full attention. Behind her, the crunch of gravel told her she wasn't alone in this silent communion. Albert Wilson's truck rolled into view, and with it came the practical reality Abigail had resisted. Questions about her father's estate, warnings about a development creeping toward the valley, and the name she'd been avoiding, Margaret Caldwell. Albert's words were familiar, yet distant, like news from another life. Over the rim of his coffee mug he spoke of land deals and legal battles, but all Abigail could see was the Mustang's dark eyes, tracking her every movement. She wanted to tell Albert to wait, to hush the world so she could stay in that moment a little longer, but the horse's gaze held her fast, and when it turned and padded back toward the pines, she realized she had a choice. Follow the world she'd built on assignments and accolades, or follow this wild guide into the mysteries her father had spent his last years uncovering. She exhaled as the horse slipped away, the forest swallowing its flame-bright coat, and Abigail felt an unfamiliar thrill of anticipation. This place, forgotten and forsaken by practical minds, still carried secrets potent enough to break her heart and reshape her future. She glanced back at the house, the faded paint, the empty windows, then toward the tree line, where the Mustang vanished among the shadows. With the first spark of purpose she'd felt in years, she picked up her father's battered camera bag, drew in the pine-scented air, and stepped through the broken fence into the unknown. The rusted wheels of Albert's truck kicked up a trail of dust as he pulled to a stop beside her, and Abigail sensed immediately that he carried more than idle curiosity. His weathered face, lined by decades of Montana winters and the burden of old friendships, betrayed a hesitant urgency as he climbed down and offered her a steaming mug of coffee balanced on his open palm. The bitter steam curled between them, carrying the scent of pine and engines, and for a moment the world narrowed to the empty fields, the crumbling fence, and the weight of unspoken questions. Albert spoke first of her father's wishes, of the letters he'd sent Abigail from this very porch, always careful to describe the changing seasons without ever demanding a reply. He reminded her how Peter Stewart, once a devoted history teacher, had poured himself into studying the land's past when ranch work no longer fulfilled him, and how for years he had stopped by every week to check on Margaret Caldwell, the woman whose name she'd been avoiding. She listened, coffee cradled in her gloves against the morning chill, as Albert described the development plan pushing into the north end of the valley, a luxury resort backed by Philip Morgan and blessed by Mayor Jenkins. He paused, eyes drifting toward the forest edge where the Mustang had disappeared, and admitted something he'd only whispered to her father. Rumor said that when this horse appeared, it meant change was coming, change too big to ignore. The thought made Abigail's heart skip, because in the eclipse of that moment she understood she was as lost and as vulnerable as the land itself, a place her father had tried to protect from forces neither of them fully comprehended. Albert's voice softened when he mentioned Margaret Caldwell again, saying that her refusal to sell had become a local legend, that she'd lived alone in her crumbling cabin for decades, documenting the valley's history with a fervor Abigail scarcely imagined. He told her Peter had been helping Margaret fight legal battles, digging through deeds and survey maps until his health failed, and that he'd left all his research in boxes Abigail would find inside the house. His gaze found hers, earnest and unguarded, and suggested gently that maybe Abigail could find in this work something more than grief, that perhaps carrying on her father's crusade might honor him better than burying herself in past regrets. As he mounted his truck to leave, Albert called out that coffee would stay hot as long as she needed, and Abigail, still staring at his retreating back, realized the universe had conspired to bring her here at this moment. The Mustang had been more than a curiosity, more than an omen. It was the spark that reignited the fire in her bones. She tightened her grip on the coffee mug as she turned back toward the sagging porch, resolve hardening within her chest. She would sift through her father's files, piece together the land's hidden story, and find Margaret Caldwell. Because if the Mustang's arrival meant change, then Abigail Stewart was ready to step into a legacy that demanded courage, truth, and the reckoning of every secret buried beneath these Montana skies. She lay awake long after the candle guttered out, the old couch groaning beneath her as if it remembered a time when this house rang with laughter instead of silence. Sleep slipped through her fingers like fine sand, and by midnight she gave up on rest and found herself kneeling among her father's boxes, the lamplight dancing over neat stacks of photocopied deeds, yellowed maps rolled like ancient scrolls, and folders bursting with handwritten notes in his precise script. Each paper she turned carried a whisper of history, accounts of survey markers shifted under cover of darkness, affidavits never filed, and photographs that felt like secret messages from another era. In one folder, labeled simply Caldwell Farm, she discovered a faded portrait of Margaret and Joseph standing proudly on the farmhouse steps in 1940, and tucked behind it, almost as an afterthought, was an image that stole her breath, the chestnut Mustang, indistinguishable from the one that had beckoned to her at dawn, its white blaze cutting through the frame like a bolt of lightning across time. Impossible, she whispered, tracing the horse's outline, yet there it was, proof that her father had seen the same silent guardian a lifetime ago. A knot of excitement and dread coiled in her chest as she spread the maps across the floor, following lines that once defined rightful ownership before greed and collusion redrew them in ink. Page after page, the story unfolded. Land wrested from families through forged signatures, boundaries redrawn by complicit officials, and a mounting sense that this valley's fate had been sold to the highest bidder long ago. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, Abigail's heart hammered with a single resolve. She would find where the Mustang had gone and the forgotten farmhouse waiting beyond the trees, because what her father had left behind demanded more than memory. It demanded action. The forest swallowed her in a cool hush, the Mustang's hoofbeats muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles underfoot, as Abigail followed with a mixture of trepidation and awe, Every breath she drew tasted of damp earth and ancient woods, the air heavy with the scent of moss and decay. She felt the past pressing in around her, stories buried beneath layers of soil, whispered by gnarled roots reaching back decades. The path wound steadily uphill, the trees growing taller, their trunks scarred by lightning and time, until finally the pines broke apart to reveal a small clearing drenched in autumn light. There, poised like a sentinel at the forest's edge, stood the log farmhouse she'd only seen in her father's photographs. Its logs were darkened by years of rain and neglect, and the roof sagged perilously on one side, but to Abigail's eye it was beautiful in its raw honesty, a testament to endurance rather than elegance. She approached slowly, boots sinking into the soft ground, every sense alert to the possibility of danger, but driven by a need she could barely name. The Mustang lingered at her side, turned toward the cabin as though beckoning her forward, its dark eyes shimmering with intent. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow crack of shadow and dust motes dancing in the stray beams of sunlight. Abigail hesitated only a moment before stepping across the threshold, the faint echo of her footfall swallowed by the hush inside. The air was stale, carrying the musk of aged wood and something faintly chemical. Developer's bath, or fixer perhaps, hinting at secrets stored here. As her eyes adjusted, she made out a figure seated by a cold hearth, frail and small against the cabin's rough-hewn walls. "Hello?" Her voice trembled with a blend of respect and dread, but the reply came not with surprise but quiet anticipation. A soft, raspy croak drifted from the darkness. "Is that you, Peter?" And Abigail froze, heart thundering. She moved deeper inside, guided by a thin shaft of light that revealed an elderly woman in a rocking chair, back straight despite the curves in her wood. Wisps of white hair framed a face as pale as winter's first frost, but her eyes burned bright and clear, locking onto Abigail's with uncanny familiarity. "No, I'm Abigail Stewart," she answered softly. "Peter was my father." The woman's gaze softened, and a flicker of recognition passed across her lined features. "Abigail Stewart," she whispered, leaning forward as if bridging an expanse of years. "You have his eyes and your mother's chin. I've been waiting for you." Abigail crossed the battered floorboards to stand before Margaret Caldwell, small in stature but vast in presence, and felt a shiver of destiny ripple through her. The cabin around them was bare yet orderly, a narrow bed tucked into one corner, shelves lined with canned goods, and on a wooden crate beside the chair, a kerosene lamp unlit, waiting to shine light on hidden truths. Margaret's voice quavered with age, but her words carried the firmness of stone. "Your father and I, we fought this fight together for years. He promised you'd come when the time was right." As Abigail processed the weight of those words, the Mustang's soft knickers drifted through the open doorway, a promise and a warning entwined. In that moment, among the gathering shadows and the scent of old wood, she knew she had stepped into the heart of her father's greatest discovery, and into a legacy that would demand all the courage she had left. Margaret's hand trembled as she led Abigail across the cabin floor toward a faded rug tucked beside the hearth, and with an effort that spoke of decades of practice, she lifted the trapdoor's heavy plank to reveal a narrow set of stairs descending into inky darkness. The beam of Abigail's flashlight trembled as she pointed it downward, illuminating walls lined with rough-hewn stones, slick with moisture, the air thick with the scent of earth and something faintly chemical, like the tang of fixer and developer, mingling in perpetual twilight. Each careful step creaked against the wooden treads, and behind her the soft scrape of Margaret's cane offered a steady echo, a fragile heartbeat marking their descent. At the bottom, the space opened into a surprising expanse, rows of sturdy shelves groaning beneath jars of chemicals, boxes of photographic paper, and countless bottles labeled in her father's precise handwriting. Developer, stop bath, fixer, the tools of an alchemist's trade meant to transform light and shadow into lasting truth. Abigail's breath caught when her eyes fell on the long, stainless steel trays lined up along a workbench, each one filled with stained water, suspended prints bobbing gently as if alive. Overhead, a single incandescent bulb cast a warm halo that illuminated pinpricks of dust floating like tiny stars in a private universe. Along the far wall, hundreds of photographs were pinned in meticulous grids. Sepia-toned ranches standing stoic against storm clouds, families huddled against wind-whipped fields, children clutching homemade toys beneath broken fences, and landscapes ravaged by the rising waters of the dams. The images felt alive in her hands, each frame a heartbeat, each face an echo of laughter and lament swept from the valley's memory. In the center of the room, a wooden table groaned beneath neat piles of unexamined envelopes, and between them lay folders bursting with color prints showing fresh survey stakes and bright property markers, markers that, according to her father's notes, never belonged where they'd been planted. Her pulse thundered as she approached the table, fingers brushing over a photograph that made her world tilt. It showed the exact clearing where she'd found Margaret's cabin, only decades older, the trees younger, the farmhouse newly built, and the same chestnut horse, white blaze and all, standing sentinel in the background. The realization struck her breathless. This place, these people, this horse, they were all bound together by a story unfolding over generations, a story her father had risked his health to preserve. As Abigail lifted one of the color prints, the chemical scent sharper in her nostrils, Margaret's voice drifted down the steps in a whisper, "These are the bones of the truth I've carried for 60 years." The echo of those words filled the cavern, wrapping around Abigail's heart with cold clarity. This dark room was more than a refuge for forgotten art. It was a vault of justice, a living archive destined to upend every deceit that had bled the valley dry. Margaret pointed to a dusty red binder stamped simply Caldwell Boundaries, and Abigail pried it open to reveal survey maps annotated in her father's precise hand. Lines redrawn, deeds crossed out and restamped, notes on forged signatures and county clerks who had looked the other way. Each page told of land stolen under cover of paperwork, of families displaced and silenced, of a community fractured by greed. She realized that these photographs were more than images. They were evidence, irrefutable proof that every boundary had once been sacred and that power had reshaped it with pen and stamp. The weight of it settled in her bones, a responsibility both terrifying and exhilarating, for in this unassuming cellar lay the means to right decades of wrongs. As she traced the lines on the map with a steady finger, her resolve crystallized. She would take this light into the open, expose every lie, and honor her father's vow that no story worth telling would remain buried in darkness. Brooks's truck door slammed with a punctuating crack as the storm clouds gathered overhead, and Abigail felt the air between her and the intruders thicken with menace before a word was even spoken. She stepped forward, heart pounding like a drumbeat, her boots sinking into the damp earth as the rain began to spatter around them. Tyler Brooks, suited and smug, held out a sheet of paper stamped with the county seal and declaring the cabin unfit for habitation, a forged inspection order that smelled of desperation more than legality. "Ms. Caldwell," he began, voice oily and practiced, "we're simply enforcing the safety codes. You have 24 hours to vacate, or we'll be forced to remove you for your own protection." Abigail's blood ran cold at the implication, the same thinly veiled threat her father had faced, because "for your own protection" meant they were already plotting her removal under the guise of benevolence. Margaret rose unsteadily from her chair, cloak of defiance draped around her frail shoulders, voice firm though quavering with age. "You've got no business here, Mr. Brooks. This is my home, and there's been no inspection. Just paperwork pushed through by your boss's cronies." The younger man at Brooks's side, arms crossed like a hulking promise of violence, shifted uncomfortably as Abigail squared her shoulders in front of Margaret, intent on protecting her. Rainwater coursed down the slanted roof, pooling at Abigail's feet as she met Brooks's gaze evenly, fists clenched. "You think you can intimidate an 84-year-old woman by bending the rules? Leave now, or we'll be forced to believe you're here to harass, not to help." Brooks' smile slid off his face like melting wax, replaced by a flicker of irritation he tried hard to conceal. He produced a hastily laminated badge and a second piece of paper, a faux warrant signed by an official Abigail had never heard of. "This is real county business," he insisted, voice dropping so only the three of them could hear. "Refuse to comply, and we'll bring in a deputy to escort you off the premises." The air crackled with tension as the wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and impending violence. Abigail felt her resolve solidify. This was no longer about settling an estate or honoring her father's memory. It was a direct challenge to the forces that had murdered her grandfather, then her father, for daring to challenge corruption. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin's battered facade, and Abigail stepped forward, planting her feet firmly. "You'll need more than forged papers and threats to drive us out," she declared, voice steady despite the quiver in her chest. "My father faced men like you and paid with his life. If you think I'll back down, you've misjudged me." The younger man's hand twitched toward his jacket, the unspoken promise of a weapon hanging in the air, but Brooks held up a hand, an unconvincing gesture of control. "Consider this your final warning," he said coldly, tucking the documents back into his breast pocket. With a last look of pure contempt, he signaled his accomplice, and together they turned away, trudging back through the mud to their vehicle. As the engine roared to life and the lights receded into the storm-dark trees, Abigail knelt beside Margaret, rain mingling with Margaret's tears, and vowed that whatever it took, legal filings, public exposure, or standing in the path of that black SUV again, they would not be moved from this place of truth and memory. The wind was already howling before Abigail bolted the cabin door behind them, a low keening that mingled with the first sheets of rain slapping against weathered logs as if the valley itself were warning them to flee. Inside her pack lay Margaret's journals and the most fragile photographs, each one a small fortress of evidence, and Abigail could almost feel the weight of decades of hope and heartbreak pressing against her spine. They moved quickly through the gathering gloom, the Mustang's absence already forgiven in Abigail's mind for shepherding them to this moment, and climbed into Dr. Davis's four-wheel-drive truck, its engine a lifeline rasping to life against the roar of the storm. Margaret squeezed Abigail's hand with surprising strength as they pulled away, the headlights carving twin tunnels of light through sheets of rain, and the edge of the forest receding behind them like a secret slipping into the night. Albert's warning echoed in Abigail's mind as they navigated the mud-slick road. "They won't stop until they've forced you off that land or broken your spirit." Every mile marker they passed felt like a gauntlet thrown down to power and corruption, and she drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, half expecting the black SUV to materialize like a nightmare chasing them out of their only refuge. Instead, they found sanctuary in the back roads Dr. Davis insisted would confuse any pursuers, a twisting cartography of forgotten logging trails and overgrown service lanes that led them far from the jurisdiction of Patterson's deputies. By the time the storm clouds began to break and dawn threatened on the horizon, they rolled into a modest veterinary clinic hidden among cottonwoods and firs, its lone sign illuminated by a flickering bulb that promised warmth and dry shelter. Inside, the clinic's antiseptic chill was a shock after the damp cabin, but Dr. Davis greeted them like long-lost kin, guiding Margaret to a spare bedroom where quilts thicker than guilt waited, while Abigail spread Margaret's photographs across the coffee table in his cozy living quarters. They talked through the night by lamplight, voices low and urgent, plotting every step. Rosa Fernandez at the library could marshal historical records to back up the photographs. Carlos Mendez could waltz them into a bank vault to secure Peter Stewart's safe deposit box, and Emily, her daughter, could breathe new life into the story with fresh eyes and a fearless pen. Outside, the clinic's windows rattled with the wind, but inside, among kind strangers and stacks of evidence, Abigail felt the first real spark of hope since the Mustang had appeared at her father's fence line. They weren't simply running, they were charging headlong toward justice, forging alliances in the storm so that when the skies cleared, the truth they carried would shine brighter than any threat Patterson or Morgan could muster. They arrived in Golden Valley just as the morning fog lifted, walking briskly across the quad of the community college where the history symposium was in full swing. Clusters of scholars with name badges milled between lecture halls, the drone of academic chatter rising like distant thunder. Abigail and Margaret paused to scan the program in their hands, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and nerves. Rosa Fernandez, Forgotten Voices, documenting rural Montana's displaced communities, was listed for just 20 minutes from now in the Humanities Building. They slipped into the back of a crowded room, the stale auditorium air heavy with the scent of old books and lecture notes, and waited as one speaker droned on about mining regulations until the moment finally came. When Rosa stepped to the lectern, her presence alone commanded attention. Her dark hair threaded with silver, her voice clear and warm as she traced the valley's battered history from dam projects that drowned farms to modern developers bulldozing family legacies. Each slide she showed before and after photographs of lost homesteads, maps scarred by power lines, felt like a call to arms. And when she spoke of responsibility to preserve erased stories, Abigail realized this was the ally she'd been searching for. As the applause faded, Abigail rose from her seat, clutching the program like a talisman, and edged forward with Margaret at her side. Rosa, gathering her notes, paused when she saw them, her eyes widening in recognition at Margaret's name. "Miss Caldwell," she breathed, bending to steady Margaret's arm. "Your photographs. I've studied them in archives and never believed I'd meet you in person." Margaret's frail shoulders straightened at the greeting, pride and relief mingling in her soft smile. In the narrow hallway, lined with windows showing the sprawling campus beyond, Abigail explained the forged inspection orders, the threats, and most of all the trove of images and maps they carried, evidence of surveys manipulated to steal land. Rosa listened without interruption, her expression shifting from disbelief to resolve, and quietly led them down the corridor to an empty classroom bathed in warm light. There, close enough that passerby wouldn't suspect the gravity of the conversation, she unraveled her own plan. Her brother-in-law, Carlos Mendez, was a property lawyer in Golden Valley who'd devoted his career to defending small ranchers. He had the kind of connections at the bank and in the Attorney General's office to bring their evidence into the light without tipping off Morgan's cronies. By the time they left the symposium, their alliance was sealed. Rosa slipped a hot cup of coffee into Abigail's hand and dialed her phone with a flourish, arranging for Carlos to meet them at First Montana Bank in 30 minutes. She unfurled campus maps and county records she carried in a battered leather satchel, pointing out hidden back entrances and lesser-known archives that might hold the final deeds Abigail needed. Margaret, warmed by the hustle and the camaraderie, sank into a chair and watched the interplay of new friends and old secrets as if savoring the reunion of long-lost comrades. Abigail, heart racing with possibility, felt the tension of the past 2 days ease just enough for her to breathe. Together, they sketched out the next steps: secure the original 1938 deed from the safe deposit box, cross-reference it with county clerk records, and then take the compiled dossier straight to the state attorney general, proof in hand, witnesses ready, and a team behind them strong enough to withstand any legal ambush. Outside, the morning sun burned away the last wisps of fog, but Abigail knew the real clarity would come when the county's own records had to yield to the truth they carried, and that day was rapidly approaching. Abigail's fingers hovered over the phone as she stared at the screen, heart thundering with equal parts hope and dread. It had been years since she'd spoken to her daughter, years of missed birthdays and hurt silence that stretched farther than the Montana plains. Yet here, in this moment, she knew she had to bridge the chasm. She pressed Emily's number and waited, each ring echoing like a tremor in her chest, until at last a tentative voice answered. "Mom?" The single word carried a world of questions. Abigail swallowed against the lump in her throat and launched into a breathless explanation, how she'd uncovered her father's secret fight for justice, how Margaret Caldwell had risked everything to document the valley's stolen land, how false charges and forged documents now threatened to bury the truth dead. As she spoke, guilt and longing wove together in her voice. She apologized for her absence, confessed her fear that her father's legacy might die without someone to carry it forward, and finally asked, with trembling earnestness, "Will you help me?" Silence crackled over the line, thick with memories and unspoken pain, before Emily's soft breath broke through. "You've always taught me to stand up for what's right," she said at last, voice steadier than Abigail expected. "I may not understand everything, but I won't let you fight this alone." Relief flooded Abigail, tears pooling unbidden, as she realized her daughter's words were more healing than any apology could be. They talked logistics, Emily's studies at Montana State, the timing of her drive south, how she could use her journalism connections to bring national attention if Morgan's influence reached too far. By the time they hung up, a bridge had been rebuilt between them, stronger for the truths laid bare and the promise of shared purpose. With renewed determination, Abigail packed the last of Margaret's journals into a waterproof case, her mind racing with the possibilities Emily's arrival would bring. She knew family could be messy, that old wounds might surface as they pored over decades of betrayal, but she also knew the power of shared history to bind hearts. In the warmth of the clinic's living room, surrounded by allies who had become like family, Dr. Davis offering tea, Rosa checking her watch to ensure they reached the bank on time, Abigail felt the weight on her shoulders shift. Tomorrow she would drive Emily through the same winding back roads that had saved Margaret, show her the hidden cabin where the real story lay, and together they would decide how to thrust these revelations into the light. As dusk settled over Golden Valley and the world beyond the clinic's windows dimmed, Abigail allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead promised danger. Morgan's men might strike back. Patterson's deputies could close in, but she no longer faced it alone. In her hands lay evidence powerful enough to upend corrupt empire building, and by her side was the granddaughter of the man who'd started this fight, ready to wield her own words as a weapon. When Abigail closed her eyes that night, it was not to nightmares, but to a fierce vision of justice. A valley reclaimed, families restored, and a mother and daughter reunited by the unbreakable bond of truth. The morning sunlight glinted off the granite facade of First Montana Bank as Abigail stepped through its heavy doors, Margaret's hand firm in hers, and Emily at her side clutching a sheaf of printed transcripts. Behind them trailed Rosa Fernandez and Carlos Mendez, their faces masks of quiet determination, and in that moment, the weight of generations of injustice settled onto the polished marble floor like dust stirred after a storm. Inside the private conference room, Abigail placed the original 1938 deed from her father's safe deposit box atop the mahogany table, its crisp lines and inked signatures a testament to truths long buried by forged surveys and corrupt contracts. She slid across maps annotated in her father's careful hand, color photographs documenting every shifting boundary, and the secretly recorded conversation between Morgan's allies, voices dripping with self-regard while plotting the displacement of families who'd called the valley home for decades. Carlos rose to address the bank's legal counsel, laying out the chain of evidence that proved Margaret Caldwell's rightful claim to nearly 100 acres now marked for the resort. He spoke steadily, invoking property law and historic precedent, while Emily stood by Abigail's side, ready to call out any attempt to muddy the facts. When questions arose about chain of title and statute of limitations, Rosa produced archived affidavits detailing the forged transfers, and Margaret herself, frail but unbowed, explained how she'd watched her life's work sidelined by those who valued profit over people. Each piece clicked into place like a final puzzle assembly, and as the bank officials exchanged reluctant glances, Abigail felt the tremor of triumph pulse through her veins. Here, in black and white, lay the proof that would force even the most powerful developer to answer for his deeds. They left the bank into the clear midday air, evidence safely duplicated for the State Attorney General's office and the local press. And Aurora, the chestnut Mustang, appeared at the bank's edge as if summoned by the gravity of their victory. Her dark eyes met Abigail's, and in that silent gaze, Abigail recognized the end of one journey and the beginning of another, one where the valley's future would be shaped by truth rather than betrayal. Walking back down the sidewalk, papers in hand, Abigail felt Emily slip an arm around her shoulders, the daughter she'd longed to know now, a steadfast partner in the fight for justice. Behind them, Rosa and Carlos exchanged hopeful smiles, already planning next steps to secure injunctions and bring charges against those who'd conspired to steal land and silence dissent. As they piled into Abigail's truck, the valley spread before them in rolling green and gold, punctuated by the distant hum of construction crews now halted in their tracks. The resort's skeletal framework, once a symbol of unchecked ambition, now stood forlorn against the sky, dwarfed by the legacy of families who'd refused to be erased. Emily leaned forward to study the horizon, voice soft but resolute. "You think we can rebuild what was lost?" Abigail reached over and squeezed her hand, the memory of her father's unwavering belief stirring within her. "Not rebuild," she said, "but restore, place by place, story by story. And with you by my side, nothing can stop us." Above them, Aurora trotted along the fence line, a steadfast guardian leading the way beyond the past into a future where justice flowed as freely as the valley's silver creek.